Hello, Rose, and today we're going to be talking about progress, considering Hegel's justification of Hegel further, and this will be thinking Hegel alongside Ivan Illich. And this is also going to be in honor of a parallax course we have starting November 4th. Please sign up today. We're looking forward to it. We've had a lot of great conversations around the topic, around Ivan Illich at Parallax. I had a great talk with Cadell, and we're following Benita Roy in the Tools for Conviviality series, which is very, very important. And this paper here is going to be exploring this interesting question of what exactly is progress? How does progress work? And in Hegel, generally people have this understanding in Hegel that the future is better than the past, that history is advancing, that things are progressing. Now, I've spoken with Cadell about this. I think Hegel's a little more complex, where yes, the future is better than the past, but there's no guarantee of a future. There may not be a future. If there's a future, it's better than the past, but it might not happen. It might not exist. So there's some nuance there, but still, we need to think this through with a little bit of this idea, and Benita Roy brought this up with Carly in her talk on Parallax, on this idea that in Christianity, Jesus seems to be the center of history. And Illich seems to have this understanding that, the pinnacle of history happened in the middle, per se. It already occurred. Well, does that mean there's no progress? Does that mean we can't progress beyond that? How do we balance this? It would seem like that notion of progress in Christianity completely goes against what we see in Hegel. So how might we think about this? Well, again, I've said many times in the past that the future is, better than the past for Hegel, and yet there's no guarantee of a future. And I think what's interesting, too, that in Hegel, there's this idea that we can't think the future, that we just interpret the past. For Marx, we shouldn't interpret, we should try to change the world. But, Zizek is like, no, we need to interpret the world, not try to change it, because there's something about the active interpretation that is central for Hegel. Well, this is very interesting, because if Hegel indeed has this kind of progressive notion, then it seems to be a progress that doesn't try to think of what that progress might look like. It doesn't really look to the future. And that kind of it's interesting, because then for Hegel, we progress by not thinking about what that progress will look like, by not thinking too hard about it. In fact, we progress by tearing with the negative, as Zizek puts it, really dealing with the present moment and the real, getting better at understanding the real. And there's almost this idea, you could say, in Hegel, is that if we don't tarry with the present and the now and get better at it, then we won't progress. But if we do tarry with the now, then we're going to get better at it, and so we will progress. And so there's this way in which coming to terms with the real of the now, to reference Lacan, is precisely the act that makes there be a future. And because in order for there to be a future, we had to tarry with that real, the future is going to be better because we're going to be better at being human subjects. And really the number one thing seems to be for the future is that we become better human subjects. So in this way, I think we can see how things can kind of go together in Hegel, where we have a future to the degree that we get better at living now, being humans now. And we do that by focusing on the now and not trying to escape it by either looking to a nostalgic past or a utopian future. Those are one of the ways I would start. And that act of looking at the subject seems kind of similar, in learning to interpret the subject better seems to be something parallel with looking to the stories of Christ, revisiting the stories of Christ, rethinking the stories of Christ over and over again, and coming to new understandings of them to help us live the now. It should also be noted, though, that, following Dietrich McCloskey, there's this idea of the great enrichment, that the quality of life for the average person on planet Earth is hundreds of folds better. We have less malaria, we have better technology. There are all these things that seem to suggest it's pretty obvious that things get better through times. But in one sense, I'm not sure if technological advancement is evidence of things getting quote-unquote better, versus things just lasting longer. And what I mean by that is technology seems to be more of an error as a result of trial and error. Technology might just get better because more time has passed, not because we've gotten better at technology per se. Now, you of course get a feedback loop where the more technology you do, the better you get at, and so on and so on. But the point is that if we look around and say, oh, we have better technology, we have higher GDP, so on and so forth, things must be getting better, That may not follow. It may just be that more time has passed. So the function of the word better there is not so clear. So just because, like, also too, we have, what is our metric for determining progress? Is it better technology? Is that evidence of things being better? Well, what about suicide rates or depression or mental health? There's a lot of people talking about the mental health crisis. Can we really say things are better today if we have worse mental health? You say, well, we have more money. Well, is money the way you determine wealth? So there's this question also of the metric by which we would determine what constitutes better or worse. And I think generally you could say, well, we're better because it would seem like the best metric is we're better at being human. And, again, tying to what we said earlier, for Hegel, to the degree we get better at being human is to the degree that there's a future. So, and we do that by tearing with the real, tearing with the negative. So these things go together. And that act seems to be similar to going back and looking at Christ and learning how to do Christ in new ways. Also, I think we can maybe approach this question if we ask, are we better at interpreting the Bible or Christ than we were in the past? And I like thinking in terms of interpretation because this might help us find a middle ground between progress, where we're getting better, but also honoring the past. Because let's take William Faulkner. Dr. Railton has done this insanely dense and useful database on William Faulkner. Do we today understand Absalom better after Dr. Railton than before? I think we absolutely understand him better today. But it's in regard to something that has existed and not changed for 70, 80 years. The works of William Faulkner, right? Like Sound and the Fury is about 100 years old. So it's something in the past, but we've gotten better at interpreting something in the past. So you see in the question of do we get better at interpreting this mixture between past and present, of which if we're getting better at interpreting today, then that means the future relative to when Absalom was written, and that future would be now, is better than then because we've gotten better at interpretation. And again, Hegel emphasizes interpretation. So it would seem that through history, we could get better at interpretation and better at understanding history. Maybe history is kind of self-contained in a sense, or self-relating, because the question of history is, do we get better at understanding history? I think that is very possible, and if so, then what would be interesting is we could say the future is better than the past if there is a future, because we will be better at interpreting the past than we were in the past. And if interpretation is an act that is uniquely human, then the very skills that get us better at interpretation may also be the same skills that make us better human beings, and thus better at being human as we go into the future. Now, it should also be noted that it would be possible that as humanity advances, if indeed there's more trial and error, if indeed more time goes by, that you could say that the future always has more potential than the past, because there's more information, there's more data, there's more things we could interpret, and more ways we could be better at interpretation. So you could say that the future always has more potential than the past. But potential is a very interesting thing, because the thing about potential is, if you don't realize potential, actually having more potential can be a torture. And it makes me think how there are some understandings of hell as a relation to God when we hate God. And so, subject of potential, advancement, beatific vision, but it actually becomes a source of hell if you don't love God, if you don't relate to God in the right way. And so likewise, if the future does, in a way, always have more potential than the past, which it probably does because there's more experience, more, maybe more people are born, more people have been born at least, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then all of this would suggest that there's more potential, but more potential does not necessarily mean it's better. It could actually be worse, because unrealized potential can be more of a burden. But you see, there's also this idea that Christ could be the best model, the best way by which we can understand how we realize the most of our potential. But that doesn't mean that Christ was the point at which no more advancement is possible. It would be because, there's a model there that we then have to do something with. Even if Christ uniquely makes contact, is God uniquely making contact with finitude and thus providing a model, that's a model which we have to interpret its meaning for us today, and we could easily have more potential today because of more time than when Christ was around, even if Christ is the best of all possible models. And so you can see where you don't progress beyond the model, but then there's a million questions of what would Christ do with drone warfare? What would Christ do with nuclear missiles? Things that are not obvious from the person of Christ or his life that we need to think through if we're to have any, if we're going to be like Christ today, because we exist in a very different situation. And in fact, I think that gets us into Paul, the model of Paul. I spoke with at the Wrestling with Christianity series, part 3, particularly with Sense Space, Jacob Kashir, talked about this, how we need to think about Paul as a model of thinking, what it means to be like Christ in situations that are not obvious, what Christ would do in. And that's a matter of interpretation. So Paul is helping us work through interpretation, how to get better at interpretation. And there's something about the person of Christ that for the Christian is unique in helping us get good at interpretation. And yet, it could be the case that there's more potential today than in the past. But again, just more potential could mean there's more sources of agony. And in fact, potential can lead to complacency. I'm made to think of the athlete who's extremely talented. Talented athletes can be cursed by that talent precisely because they know they're talented, so they don't practice, they don't get better, and so they actually never realize their fullest potential. So in that way, potential can be a curse. So likewise, the very fact that we have so much potential today could be a curse because we know we have a lot of potential and we've become complacent. So again, I think we can fairly say that the future has more potential than the past, but that's only maybe evidence that the future is better. It depends on what we do. It's contingent. So far we've suggested that understanding historic progress might be best accomplished if we consider progress like our relationship to a book and reading in general. Perhaps today we can read and understand Faulkner better than ever before, but this is only thanks to Faulkner and his work. Furthermore, if we don't understand Faulkner, we might be tortured and bothered by that ignorance more than in the past, precisely because today we can more so and more readily understand Faulkner. So you just apply that to everything, and I think this is the double move where you can have progress and yet also acknowledge that, say, Christ or interpreting the past studying Christ or interpreting the past are uniquely important activities. I think all this can also help us see the distinction between evolutionary change and developmental change. Evolution and development are often conflated. That's a mistake. Benita Roy brings this out. Just because there's a change in evolution does not mean it's developmental. It could be negative. That's all going to be dependent on the environment. So likewise, just because we get more potential just because things are changing, if we don't realize that potential or integrate with our environment, then that evolution could actually prove devolutionary. So likewise, what's interesting is this idea that to the degree our evolution into the future proves to be developmental will be contingent on to the degree we get better at interpreting Christ, interpreting history, interpreting the past. So that's where your progress is not merely movement into the future, because that merely increases potential, but it's contingent on how good you get at interpreting history. So interpretation is what your skills of interpretation condition to the degree you can realize the increase of potential in the future, ergo to what degree evolution is actually development. And the keystone for the Christian for development moving into the future is the person of Christ, and then working and tearing with the Holy Spirit. And I do think it's important to realize that you're in an age with the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit can absolutely be just as important as the age of Christ. So we have to see those things in concert. Here, I think we can also touch on this kind of idea that consciousness was a mistake. You hear that sometimes where evolution made a mistake to give rise to consciousness. So here's a question. Is consciousness evolution or development? I think Hegel would say it depends on what we do now. It's completely contingent. Like, if consciousness gives us the ability to engage in abstraction, but if we use that abstraction to destroy ourselves, then consciousness was a mistake. But if we use that abstraction to create subjects who are capable of creativity and imagination that would have otherwise never existed in the universe, perhaps even negantopathy, as Cadell-Lass will talk about in Systems and Subjects, then the evolution of consciousness will prove to be a development. But the question of if consciousness is just an evolution or if it's a developmental evolution is contingent on us now. And the claim would be that the likelihood that consciousness proves to be a development will be relative to how good we are at interpretation, becoming the kind of subjects who can interpret. And for the Christian, it will be particularly tied to how good we get at interpreting the person of Christ, which Paul gives us a model for in his letters. As the world progresses relative to its ability to better read and understand the Bible for the Christian, only gaining more potential innately, so we progress to the degree we get better at reading the world per se, which is to say we learn to better read to what was always already there in new and dynamic ways. So again, for Hegel, it's reconciling ourselves with what is, and Dylan Shaw and Dimitri had that tremendous talk on that, and the future is entirely open. It is the radical other that self-consciousness collectively can move into reason relative to reference the phenomenology of spirit. And so we could say for Hegel and Illich, and then also Hume, who I'll talk about in the paper, to the degree we learn to quote-unquote read and interpret what is, will be to the degree that we actually progress, which suggests that progress occurs to the degree that the now interaction interprets the past and present, and in this way it makes no sense to suggest that the future is better than the past in some overall sense. Yes, the future is always more evolved than the past, which is to say it has undergone more trial and error, which is ultimately all evolution is, but that doesn't mean it will be more developed necessarily, only that it will have more potential, which might precisely be the source of our torture. So indeed, the future will have more potential than the past, but that potential, if not realized, will be precisely why the future is worse. And if the future is worse, then it may not exist at all, because the pathology that is unleashed upon us may be worse. But from the moment it becomes worse, then the future could be better if we change course. So there's always the potential for the future since the future is entirely open, there is always hope. But that hope is contingent on us now. It is not guaranteed. But a guaranteed hope arguably is an impossibility. For hope to be real, it has to be contingent, and it would seem to be contingent on us. But because there is the possibility of hope, there is the possibility of progress, but that will be to the degree we come to terms to reconcile ourselves with what is now, today. And that's a work all of us can begin at this very moment. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. And please sign up for the Parallax course. We're really looking forward to it. You can find more about Look at the Birds of the Air at Parallax, the website and their YouTube channel. And thank you so much for your time.